Alright, we're here today in the regional tasting room. My name's Kieran Haslett-Moore, beer specialist at Regional Wines, and we're here with Geoff Griggs, our beer consultant. Here to mark a pretty special milestone in that we've just reached our 20th year of doing beer tastings up here at Regional. So just wanted to have a bit of a talk with Geoff and see some of the history that's gone down in this room. First, Geoff, how did you get into beer and
I guess originally it was back in the 70s. I was my first ever beer was bought for me by my American uncle, I think, who he went off to live in Wichita as a young man and married an Austrian lady, and then they used to come back to England regularly to catch up with the family. And I remember one day my uncle, my mother's brother, said, "All right, I think it's about time I took Geoff to the Working Men's Club, which was up in town, up in London, where he used to drink." And he obviously hadn't been there for, I don't know, a couple of years or maybe more than that. But we bowled in, and this place was, as you can imagine, a London working men's club. It was like it was full of these people that obviously had many years' history together, and they all knew each other. And my uncle was just welcomed in as if he hadn't been away, which was pretty amazing, really, considering he was living half a world away. But the end result of that was, of course, that at one point that evening, I remember I was drinking brown ale because it was comparatively sweet and comparatively non-alcoholic, bottled brown ale, I remember it was. At one point I remember I had this lineup. It must have been sort of 9 or 10 glasses in the row, and they were little half-pint glasses, sort of small-sized bottles. And I remember when we went out that evening, my mother had said to my uncle, she said, "Remember, he's only allowed 2 pints." And my uncle said to me on the train going up into town, he said, "Yeah, but she didn't say how many halves." And that was. I don't remember much about the latter part of that evening. I certainly don't remember getting home at all. But that was one of my very earliest memories of drinking beer. And in those days, it would have been obviously just a very standard English brown ale. And then I sort of got a bit more involved in the pub scene, sort of. I do remember drinking lagers in the early days, but finding them, like most beers, I just wasn't actually that impressed. And in the early days, I sort of Camera was just sort of getting going, and I had a friend, the brother of my very best friend was pretty heavily into camera, and he sort of introduced me to it and said that there's this organisation going, and I think you'd be interested in it. And then I obviously just sort of started going out looking for traditional English beer as it was. The term real ale didn't really mean much to me at that time. It's just the stuff that wasn't lager.
Yeah.
I now refer to it as real ale, and obviously that's the acronym that people use for it. But CAMRA was the acronym that people now use for it. But in those days, it was just the stuff that wasn't cold and fizzy, and it wasn't yellow, and it wasn't lager. And this stuff had obviously a lot more flavour, and very quickly sort of developed a taste for it, and then became involved in my local CAMRA branch. Subsequently, after a few years, became chairman of that branch, stayed chairman of it for about, I think, 16 or 17 years. Started the branch newsletter. That was my first ever writing about beer. Basically, just saying, if you go to this pub, there's some good beer there usually. One of the main roles of the branch was, other than just meeting up and having a few beers every week, was to decide which pubs within our branch area were going to be in the Good Beer Guide each year. So the Good Beer Guide, CAMRA's annual publication, the country's best pubs. I think it started off with about 3,000 pubs. It's probably a lot more than that now. And that we used to go around looking for the best pubs, the pubs where the beer was in the best sort of condition, and the pubs where we basically enjoyed the beer the most. And those were the ones that we ended up putting in the Good Beer Guide. Then on a trip to New Zealand in 1990, the lady who's now my wife, on a one-day trip to Wellington, and I remember she looked out for a beer for me. She knew I was into beer, and she looked out a beer for me. Went to a liquor store. I think it was on the corner where the dentist is now at St George, the St George Hotel.
Oh, yeah.
On corner of Manners and Willis.
Yeah.
And I think there used to be a liquor store there. And she went in and apparently asked the guys, I want something that's a bit unusual. And the guy sold her a quart bottle of Waikato Draft, which I guess at the time, 1991, this would have been, was unusual for Wellington.
It wasn't Lion Brown.
Yeah, on the basis that it wasn't Lion Brown, it would have been unusual for Wellington. And that was really my first memory of drinking. That was my first memory of drinking in Wellington. I had my first ever New Zealand beer the year before, visiting Auckland. My first ever visit to New Zealand. I arrived in Auckland and had a beer at the Albion Hotel in the corner of Wellesley and Hobson Street, still there. There's a cellar bar beneath that hotel. I was staying there because it was cheap and it was very central. So it ticked two boxes. I was right in the centre of town, and it was comparatively cheap. So that was a good place to stay. So I went down to the cellar bar, and I think it was a Friday night, and the place was pumping. And I just stood back from the bar because I could see these taps, and they meant nothing to me at all. It was like, I just arrived on the flight, and I did what I usually do, which is just watch to see which pump was pouring the most beer, and working on the principle, I guess, that without even thinking about it really, that was likely to be the beer that was in the best condition.
Yeah.
And of course, having waited a few minutes and then had one of those, and it turned out it was a Lion Red, which I suppose it would have been back in 1990. And I remember getting this glass thrust towards me as a little small handle glass, but only about this tall, which I now know to be what was then referred to as a Kiwi Pint, and it looked much smaller to me. But anyway, there we go. And I had this beer, and I sort of stepped back from the bar, took my first tentative sip of it, and I remember looking around, and I was sort of totally convinced that everybody was going to suddenly turn around and start looking at me and laughing at me, because I thought somebody sort of put half the beer in and then filled the glass up with soda water or something, because there's this really sort of sweet and incredibly fizzy and very flavourless beer. And then I obviously subsequently found out that's exactly what it's meant to taste like. But very odd experience. And by the time I came back in the following year, and I'd kept in touch with Pip, who I'd met in Wellington, and she invited me to her flat, and we had a meal together. And we subsequently went down to the South Island, but before I did that, I came to regional, and somebody had told me that this is the place to go to find beer. And I remember somebody, I think it was Johnny Sutterby, who used to work for regional.
Yeah.
He pointed at me and he said, "Yeah, you're English. You're going to like this," and showed me bottles of Pink Elephant. And in those days, the beers were PBA and PDA. And I think Mammoth was probably around by then as well. But I remember buying a bottle of PBA, and there was this wonderful perfuming hop aroma and a big solid malt background, and I thought, yes, here is a beer from New Zealand that I can actually drink. And then obviously I made it my mission to find the Pink Elephant Brewery, and went across on the ferry with Pip, and we visited the Brightwater, where the original Pink Elephant Brewery was. And I remember driving up the driveway in a rental car, and there was a wooden sign that says, no, not open to the public, do not proceed, brewery closed, And then there was another sign a little bit further on, definitely not open, So right, no, I'm going to ignore this. This beer's too good. I've got to find out. So I drove straight past this and knocked on the door, and it was classic. It was sort of almost the head round the side of the door. Who's this coming to the door? And very, very suspicious. Of who I was. And we got talking, and then camera came out, and very quickly we established that there was the English link between us. He's a Kentishman, and I was born in Sussex, which is the next county across, and we actually both did love English beer, and we were both in New Zealand at the time, obviously, and he was brewing something that I could actually associate with, and I thought that this is beer. I can drink this. That was very early days, 1991, probably would have been October, maybe early November. That's my earliest memory. So, regional gave me the bottle, Johnny Sutterby. Thanks, Johnny, wherever you are. And he inspired me to go and track down this beer, and then subsequently, I remember, beers like Parrot and Jigger. I don't know if they were going by then, but I remember they were soon on the scene, and Strongcroft out at Petone, and Anchor at Pororua, the notorious Jamie Jameson with Anchor Blotto, and a few others, or some up in Broford's up in Auckland, and New Begin That was probably a little bit later. Some of those early beers.
Yeah, Sunshine must have been coming.
Sunshine, yep. But very quickly Regional. I remember Regional took on Sunshine, and there was this really nice, crisp 4% golden lager coming out of Gisborne, which, you know, a real backwater of craft brewing in those days, and probably still regarded as one today. This sort of place right out on the coast, miles from anywhere, producing a 4% reasonably hopped, crisp all malt lager, which was, for the time, you know, really, really rare. And it obviously went off in Wellington, thanks to people like Fraser at Bodega pumping it like that, and obviously Regional selling heaps and heaps and heaps of it. That's my earliest memories. And the beers were downstairs on trestle tables, and these trestle tables, I remember the weight of the beer. The trestle tables were like that, real lumbering under the weight of the beer.
Buckling.
Yeah, they were buckling under the weight of the beer. Yeah.
You want to tell us about your first experience of the tastings up here in this room?
Yeah, well, I remember I shifted to New Zealand in February. Well, I came to New Zealand in February 1995 and got down to Wellington probably about 6 or 7 weeks later, having spent a few weeks staying with my in-laws up in Taumarunui, middle of nowhere. Got down to Wellington. We were house sitting for some friends of the family who were, I think they'd gone overseas, and they lived in Tawa. And very quickly, I obviously made my way into Regional to find out what was going on. Met Grant and Bart, Grant's brother, and started buying beers and just talking about beers. And I don't quite remember how the conversation started, but it became apparent that they were just starting to think about doing some beer tastings. And I remember coming along. I don't know if I was at the very first one. I may not have been, but I certainly would have been either, the second or third one. I would have been there. And it was Grant running these things, using a little bit of help from Neil McInnes.
Yeah.
Who in those days was writing what was probably New Zealand's first ever beer column in the City Voice newspaper.
Yeah.
That column carried on for a while, and I remember sitting right at the very back of this room with Pip, and we did some tastings, and as the evenings went on, I sort of found myself chipping into the conversation, making a few comments, and hearing a few things like, well, that doesn't sound right, and saying, no, I actually think this is probably what actually happens with that beer. And we were just talking about beers in general and tasting. There weren't that many really good beers around in those days. But, and Grant just basically sidled up to me one day after the tasting and said, look, he said, you clearly know more about beer than any of us. He said, you might as well run the tastings. And I was like, oh, I've never done anything like that. I've never done about speaking in public and that kind of thing. And I was quite really nervous about it, actually. I'd never done anything like that before. Even at the Beeb, I'd never done too much sort of public speaking, which this was. And I was really, really nervous. But Grant was pretty keen for me to do it, and I did it. And I guess the rest is history. That's where I started doing beer tastings for Regional. And some of those early tastings were hilarious. The range of beers in those days wasn't great. I remember we did one in the very early days. It was Japanese beer and karaoke, and the Japanese beer was basically the big tall metal cans of Sapporo. I can't remember if anything else. There probably were one or two others available. Certainly nothing of any great interest. And I remember sipping away on the large cans of Sapporo, and then the karaoke going. And by the end of the evening, this room that we're sitting in now, I'm amazed it isn't downstairs, because we had the floorboards absolutely thumping, and we did the B-52's Love Shack, and we must have done it 10 times, and it was horrendous, but it seemed really good at the time. It seemed really good, but the out of tune singing actually seemed to work with the song somehow, and it was very, very funny. Legendary evening. And I guess the other one from the very early days that I remember is something that we wouldn't get away with now, was coming into a tasting and doing a beer and cigar matching evening. And I would say that within about 20 minutes of that evening starting up, you wouldn't be able to see from one side of the room to the other. And looking back on it now, it's very, very funny. But at the time, it was a really fun evening at the time. But looking back on it now, you sort of think you'd never be able to get away with anything like that. You'd have to go and sit outside.
Even then, it would be frowned on.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So those are probably some of my earliest memories of tastings at Regional, and seen a lot of people come and go over the years, and it's always nice to see some of the old faces. But every time I come here, even now, 20 years later, you see new people coming along, and they're sort of wide-eyed sort of at the way we do things, and there's a lot more acceptance when we give people radical beers than there was in the early days. I mean, I remember bringing out something vaguely sour. I remember an alembic or something like that, and people's reaction to it for the first time. And you still get that reaction, but not as often because people are more aware of what's going on. But those early days.
I remember my early days, which would be the mid days.
Yeah.
A couple. Basically almost getting up and storming out at the thought that anyone would have voted for a sour beer.
Yeah.
That was at a Belgian beer tasting, and they were absolutely horrified and could not bear to be in the room with such weirdos.
Yeah. I think people actually thought, we're taking the mickey. This can't be for real. People aren't actually enjoying drinking this. It's a bit like my first taste of the Kiwi beer in Auckland. That everybody's going to turn around and start laughing at them and saying, actually, we're not really taking this seriously, but we're just taking the mickey out of you.
Oh, here's Mr. Wenman. We might have to edit
Peter,
this out too.
Come on in. Come on in.
So, Geoff, how have things changed over the last 20 years, both in these tastings and in the scene in general?
Well, I'd say that we went through a stage where we got incredibly busy, and we went to actually 3 nights in a row, or two nights and a what we used to call the matinee performance on a Saturday, which was quite amusing. I guess that was probably the heyday of tastings in terms of the numbers, but it was really hard work. But the room used to get really, really full. Obviously, there are other people out there now doing tastings, but I think certainly in your tenure in recent years, you've done a fantastic job of bringing the tastings right up to date, making them really, really relevant, pushing the boundaries, and I think that's what Regional has always tried to do. It's always tried to be that one step ahead of everybody else. And in the old days, it was really easy, and nowadays it's much harder because there's beer launches happening around town. And last night, we had Unite, the ladies' beer being launched and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of other beer-related events going on, but staying relevant and staying up to date and staying at the forefront of what's going on is always something that Regional has sort of managed to do. It's always been had that little bit of edginess that I really like about Regional. No matter who's been involved, it's always had that little extra thing, and I think it's been great to see. Certainly, the other thing that I've noticed is that the age of the people in the room has got gradually younger. Whereas once it was all expat poms whinging about how great things used to be, and these beers taste a bit like what they remembered from the old country. And nowadays, there's a whole new generation that actually are used to beers with big flavours and just want the latest, greatest, most radical out there beer, and we've had to sort of change with that and provide a tasting that is relevant to those people. I guess that's sort of kicked me dragging and screaming in some cases, but I mean, I have to say, to the point now where I'm beginning to sort of feel like a bit of a dinosaur after 20 years. I'm the old timer that's sort of still stuck in the past, and a lot of these guys now come to the tastings having drunk beers that I haven't even tasted before. Last night I was expecting people to know more about the beers than I did. As it turned out, we've got 8 beers on the table here that only one of which I've ever tasted before, and that was the previous year's, the Fresh Hopped Vandal. But the rest of the beers are completely new, and I think they were new to most people in the room, and that's great. And that's always been Regional's strength. That we've never given away the secret of what the tasting's going to be completely, and then when you under deliver in your advertising, and then when people get into the room and they see what they're going to taste, and with food as well, they go home at the end of the evening, they had a fantastic night, and with a bit of luck they've learned a bit as well. I guess that's always the thing. It's that balance between education, and having a really good time and feeling good about beer. And the feeling good about beer is the thing you associate with regional, and the education is the thing that keeps bringing you back, I guess, for more, wanting to learn more. Absolutely. And in a way, it's forced me to up my game as well. I mean, I've had to learn more to keep ahead. Yeah. Which has been great from my point of view. And Grant, I've said this many times, but Grant was the person that actually said to me that I should try and make a living out of writing about beer. And he said, nobody's doing it, you should do it. Yeah. I'd like to have some words with Grant about that now. No, I don't regret doing it, but it's led me down a path that's taken me in a particular direction, and I'm very pleased to have done what I've done. And in a way, there's a legacy out there. The written word will sort of hang around long after I'm gone, and people will probably look back at it and laugh at it and say, "God, that's so out of date." He once referred to Heineken as hoppy. Well, back then it was. It probably isn't now, but yeah.
Much like we look back at Michael Jackson's works, some of the stuff now.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to think he's not been gone that long, and yet some of the stuff appears really quaint nowadays. You read some of his words, and you think, man, that's quite quaint. Yeah. And he gets things wrong as well, and it's now with hindsight. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. Yeah. But in his time, he was completely, breaking the barriers, breaking the boundaries, and he was right at the forefront. And legendary. And I guess Michael and Grant really were both the inspirations. I mean, Grant inspired me to do it, and Michael was the inspiration for what I should try and achieve. And I don't claim to have got anywhere near that, but in my own little way, I'd like to think they've contributed to the beer knowledge and the furthering of good beer in New Zealand. And it's something I look back at with pride, because I remember members of the family and friends saying, "Oh, you'll never get Kiwis to drink anything other than Spates and DB." And I look at them now, and I see the next generation coming on, the youngsters, 24, 25, and they're drinking good beer.
Absolutely, and never drinking bland beer.
They've actually got
they've just going straight to good beer.
That's right. They've completely jumped over the top of it. Whereas in those early days, we were trying to convince people that drank mainstream beer that actually there was something better. The next generation is really good answer. Actually, the next generation that's followed, they've never gone through that stage. In the same way that there's a lot of Kiwis that would have never probably drunk box wine. We're now seeing Kiwis that are growing up and going straight into fine beer.
Yeah, which is fantastic. All right, well, maybe we should have a toast to that and to 20 years of beer tasting.
Yeah, cheers.
To Michael and to Grant.
To Michael and Grant,
Cheers.
Absolutely. Cheers, Kieran. Cheers.